Hello everyone and welcome back to the video. Today we're going to be talking about the top 5 most common mistakes in Castle Age. I've been doing a lot of coaching lately for all kinds of ELOs, and I'm sure that pretty much everyone who is improving on their game is making one or more of these mistakes. Be sure to comment down below which mistakes you're making, but anyways, let's hop in and take a look at the top 5 list. Starting off at number 5, we've got neglecting to add extra town centers. The best way to play Age of Empires 2 in Castle Age is to make use of the 200 stone that you have in the early game. The best thing to do with this 200 stone is to go ahead and make 2 town centers in Castle Age. The reason why we want to go ahead and make extra town centers in general is to develop our economy by making more villagers, but also to protect our economy. The town center is a great defensive option that can hold 15 villagers when enemy units come. It also fires arrows to fight off those units, so it has really good defensive impact, as well as doubling if you make the first one, and then of course tripling your villager production once you get to 3 TCs compared to just the 1. Adding TCs is a great way to grow your economy and doesn't really hurt your military production in the short term because we bank up a lot of resources in Feudal Age, so we're easily able to field some army at the start of Castle Age. So adding in the town centers might slow down how much army we're able to produce for a few minutes, but then once the villagers kick in and once we have a lot more resources, we can ramp up production in late Castle Age and play with a much healthier economy that allows us to make more units and eventually get to Imperial Age at a good time. Don't neglect the town centers, it's the best way to play the game. Moving on to number 4, I see this mistake happen quite often actually, and it tends to happen when players get too much in their head and too focused on countering what their enemy is doing rather than sticking with their own plan. And at number 4, I've got mixing a bunch of different units too early without getting the proper upgrades for these units. I see this happen time and time again where a student would go for like scouts into knights, but then as soon as they see enemy having camels, they'll immediately switch to pikes and then maybe even to crossbows before even setting up their 3 DC. It's really bad to do this on your early game economy because you simply can't afford to do this many tech switches in the early game. If you try and mix too many units, what you're going to end up with is a big mix of units in one army composition, similar to what an AI does in their games, and since you don't have the proper upgrades on these units or the proper mass of them, they're going to be extremely ineffective in fights. So even though you might think you have a counter to everything your opponent can make, in reality your counter units are very weak and they're not actually going to perform in the fights like you'd expect them to. I'd much rather have you guys, or much rather suggest to you guys, to stay on 1 or 2 units in the early game, preferably just one, and the one you've been massing from Feudal Age, or the one that you plan to go for in early Castle Age, and stick with it until you get your 3 TC setup. It's totally natural to mix in monks or siege to support that army initially, but then once you get the 3 TC setup, you can go ahead and add another unit class or a completely different transition, but before that it's generally too difficult to do so. Make sure to prioritize getting a mass of that unit and upgrades on it before transitioning into a different unit. So having 1 unit massed properly is much better than having 3 different types of units without proper upgrades and in poor numbers. Alright, moving on to number 3, we've got idling production and town centers. This is a classic mistake and it happens not just in Castle Age, it happens at all points of the game, but I think especially in Castle Age, this is where it hurts you the most. Because in Castle Age, if you idle your production, you can get overrun by enemy units and they're strong enough to take out your buildings and your villagers. And if you idle your town centers, it hurts a lot more than Feudal Age because now we might have multiple town centers. So for idling them, we're getting hurt maybe 2 or 3 times as much as we'd get hurt in Feudal Age. Even if it's just 1 or 2 minutes of idle time, it definitely does add up. The best thing to do to remind yourself to produce army and villagers is to look at the resources tab that you have, in the top left corner or wherever it is, and make sure that the resources don't get too high. As soon as you have some resources, make sure you're spending them, and chances are you're going to have some idle buildings if the resource count gets too high. Another thing to note is that it's not good to queue too many units at once in each building because then it's basically units that are not coming out for a while. So make sure you're cycling through your production buildings and only queuing like 2 villagers at a time from each town center and 2 units from each production building, but just do that regularly, like every 30 seconds, to ensure you have a constant flow of units, but they don't have like 5 or 10 units in one queue that take forever to come out. That's basically just a waste of resources and it's no different than having it in the stockpile. Alright, moving on to number 2, it's something that I've noticed recently and I never really realized how big of a problem this truly is, but like I said, from the coaching sessions, it really stood out to me, and this is simply doing nothing with military. I see a lot of people that would make army and commit to army and would just simply keep it at home without even moving out. I don't think you should always go ahead and attack your opponent every time you have the chance to, but just moving around the map, looking for enemy army or looking for vision or to control hills is a great thing to do with even defensive troops. Like if I'm looking to defend my base and I don't care to attack my opponent because I've got the better economy, I won't just sit in one spot with my skirmishers. I'm going to move around the map with my skirms and maybe even try to look for my opponent so that if I see him out on the map, I can punish that and kill his army. If you're on defense, you can't obviously kill villagers because you're not going to go forward and attack vills, but you could kill your opponent's army, and that's going to help pull you ahead. So indirectly, by playing defense and being active, we can actually gain advantage and be the aggressor if we catch our opponents out too far. So make sure you don't just sit there in the middle of nowhere and do nothing. Alright, before I show you guys number one, I'm gonna go ahead and talk about an honorable mention real quick because it's a really simple one, and this is basically getting upgrades for no reason. This happens not all the time, so I didn't put it in my list, but I've definitely seen it a couple times now, and it's something that definitely needs to be, sorted out. It's a really bad habit. So what do I mean by this? Basically, if you're making crossbows and you want to later in the game you want to switch into hussars, it doesn't make sense for encapsulate to get light cav and armor when you don't even care to make light cav, or you can't even upgrade to hussar because you're not an imperial age. So the idea is you only want to get the upgrades for a tech switch when you're about to make that unit or when you already have a bit of that unit on the field. If you get it too early, you're basically just throwing away resources that you might need for something else that would help you in the short term. Investing into long term is good, but don't invest into something that gives you no returns immediately or no returns in the near future. It's pretty much a logical thing to do, but sometimes people might forget and just get upgrades for the sake of getting them and not actually think, why they're actually picking them up now. And this is a little bonus tip here in the honorable mention. Get Town Watch in Castle Age. It's going to help you very greatly in defending your base and also in expanding because you're going to have more vision, and it's just easier to play. It's 75 food. It's a really small investment. Don't get Town Patrol ever pretty much because it's 500 resources, but Town Watch is nice to pick up. Alright, moving on to number one, the last and final common mistake on my list here. It happens to pretty much everyone, even top players alike. It's floating resources. Floating resources is one of the worst things you can do in Castle Age. This is the age where you want to develop as quickly as possible to either overrun your opponents or to put yourself further ahead. So the more you're floating resources, the less you're investing into either the current or the short term or the long term. A long-term investment would be like an economy upgrade like bow saw or heavy plow that kicks in over time, and a short-term investment would be going for a few extra knights to put more pressure on your opponent and to maybe put some aggression and take him out, or at least start raiding him, start sniping his vills and force him to make army of his own. But short-term investments, or could even be a long-term investment, is making monks to pick up relics, doing pretty much whatever you need to be doing to put yourself further ahead. The worst thing you can be doing though is stockpiling resources, because if I've got 1,000 food and 1,000 wood in my bank, that's terrible. I'd much rather just find a way to get an extra couple town centers and use those resources on more farms and more villagers to turbo my economy and find myself in a much better position 5 minutes in the future. If I just leave those resources in my stockpile, I'm not actually doing a whole lot with them, and they're just going to sit there and just kind of be a wasted potential pretty much. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you guys learned something. If you do any of these mistakes, let me know in the comments which ones you do, and hopefully you can sort them out over time and become a better player just by picking up a couple, better habits and working on your bad habits. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.